Okay, so we're doing the lymphatic system. Lymphatic system kind of goes a little bit with the cardiovascular system in the fact that it helps drain fluid out. If you think about the cardiovascular system, blood gets pumped away from the heart. It's getting to the tissues. Why is blood going to the tissues? Why do we have blood going to the tissues? Give it oxygen, nutrients. Okay, so once the blood goes through the arteries, down to the arterioles, then into the capillaries, okay, then you're going to have the resources coming out of the actual vessels, out of the blood. You'll have glucose, you'll have fats, you'll have nutrients, you'll have oxygen, and you're going to have a little bit of the water that's making up the plasma, and that's going to come out of the blood. Okay, so that's going to move into the tissue itself. And remember we said when we looked at the tissue, the cells are making up the tissue, but there's space that's sitting in between those cells, and we call that interstitial fluid. Okay, so we're going to come back to that name, that interstitial fluid. That's the fluid that basically bathes the cells that are making up your tissue. And it's there where the actual oxygen and resource exchange is going to occur. Now, a lot of things will generally come back into the blood, but our blood is moving so fast, and it has to be kind of fine-tuned. It can't be too large as far as letting objects in. Objects have to be kind of small, because if you have an infection of a tissue or a virus in a tissue, it's going to be a problem if that gets back into your blood vessel system. Okay? And so our lymphatic system helps drain any additional fluid that's sitting in our tissue. Okay? If you have problems with our lymphatic system, that can lead to swelling or edema, and you'll get a lot of swelling. There's something called elephantitis, where the lymph nodes are just really problematic. The legs will swell. It almost looks like an elephant foot. Okay? So our lymphatic system is very important. It sits kind of next with the cardiovascular system, and so we're just going to go over that today. Now remember, this is on exam 2, not exam 1. Okay, so if we look at the lymphatic system is going to be composed of 3 parts. You're going to have vessels, just like you have in the cardiovascular system. You're going to have actual vessels that make up the lymphatic system. You'll have tissues and organs that will contribute to it, and then you're going to have the actual fluid. In blood, the fluid is called plasma. In the lymphatic system, we call it lymph. The primary role is to return the interstitial fluid and any leaked plasma and proteins from the blood, and it's going to return it back. And it's also pretty big with immunity, and we'll talk about why and how that kind of makes sense. If you look at different components of the body, we have several areas, tissues. The thymus is going to sit in our neck. Don't think of this as the thyroid. The thyroid will go around our neck like a necklace, but right below that, generally right around the area where the heart begins, you're going to have the actual thymus. This is actually most active during youth, and so it's not as active now. We have parts of our lymphatic system in the back of our throat and the edge of our throat. Our tonsils are actually part of this as well. And in the intestines, if we look down here in the intestines, okay, we have these pyre patches, and the goal of this is a little bit more having to do with immunity. This part of the lymphatic system basically helps protect or keep bacteria from getting past the gut, keeping it from leaking past the gut and into the bloodstream. Okay, so an overview look at the lymphatic system. It's going to have its vessels and systems pretty much sit very close to most of the regular cardiovascular system. Here you have your capillary beds, and the lymphatic system itself is actually going to have its own set of capillaries. And they look very similar, except there's several things that make them just enough to be different and function just enough that they're actually considered 2 different systems. They probably look the most like veins out of the system. They have the three layers as most vessels do, the intima, the media, and the externa, but they're a lot thinner, so that's something else to keep in mind. Typically, the natural flow will be from the capillaries. It will move up. It will collect in certain areas, typically in nodes. It'll move through trunks, which is just another name for an area of collections, and eventually it's going to travel down ducts to get back into the cardiovascular system. And so we're collecting this fluid that was in this tissue. It's not as easy to get back into the cardiovascular system itself. It's actually also a filtering system too. It's very much makes sense when we talk about the immunity aspect to this, okay? Because you might be asking, why doesn't it just return back to the blood? Why do we have to have this whole new system to do this? And we'll explain that in a second. Eventually, the fluid has to get, once it's clean, we'll talk about that, it's going to get back to the actual plasma itself. Any of the water fluid will return there. It's a one-way system. It carries lymph from peripheral tissues to the venous system. We already looked at the lymphatic capillaries. Moves into collecting vessels, and then trunks and ducts that will feed into the subclavian veins. Okay, so again, that's something else to know. Where does it feed into? And it's going to be in the subclavian veins that we're going to find this. So everything's moving up. If we look at the capillaries, structurally they're going to be very different. They're a lot looser, if you will. They're composed of filaments to help anchor them down to the tissue, but they have larger doors, if you will. If you look at these areas where the slits are, these are doorways to get into the vessels, and they're a lot larger than what you would find in the cardiovascular system. That's going to allow fluids and large particles to move in. Let's see. Here's another example. Here's our vessels. If you note the space in between the cells, a lot larger than what you would find in the cardiovascular system. All the fluid from this interstitial space, this interstitial fluid, most of it will drain through here, and it's going to move and eventually move up into the nodes and then into the trunks and ducts. Okay? So, why, we come back to that question, why even bother with the system? Okay? Well, this system is largely connected with our immunity, in that you're going to have a large production of certain types of white blood cells in some of the areas of these of this entire system. The nodes, for example, the thymus itself is going to be making a certain type of immune cell called a T cell. Okay? And so what this does is it places checkpoints in this lymph system. And so as that fluid moves up, remember, it's just taking fluid randomly and quickly, and part of that fluid can have a lot of junk in it, right? If you have an infection, it's going to have junk that you don't want to have it going back into your normal cardiovascular system. If it were able to go into your cardiovascular system, that's going to be a problem. You get bacteria in there a lot faster, viruses, parasites, whatnot, that's infecting your tissues. And so it provides different checkpoints at each of these nodes. These nodes are going to be filled with white blood cells. Those white blood cells are going to scavenge and look for problems. And if there's bacteria or something that's causing you an issue, it's going to clean that up, eat it, and it's going to help clean that fluid up. So when it gets back to the cardiovascular system, then it's good. So it's kind of like a little mini filter, if you will. Again, it has three layers as the vein, but they're thinner. Well, I give this term lymphatic trunks. Lymphatic trunks are formed by the union of the largest collecting vessels. So when the collecting vessels join up, we call them trunks. You have jugular trunks, lumbar trunks. Eventually, these are going to lead to the main ducts. The ducts are the areas that are going to actually eventually drain back into the cardiovascular system. So here on our image, we have our nodes. When these vessels join up, they become trunks. And then eventually, the area that they finally drain into, those are the ducts. a lot of ducts and trunks and vessels. They have to have a valve system just like the veins. They have those valves to keep fluid moving back down. It keeps everything moving back up to the heart. Again, the same concept to get the fluid to move. These lymphatic systems have to sit in between muscles, and the muscles help push the fluid up. And that's what's going to get the force to help this fluid get back to the cardiovascular network. As far as the lymphatic ducts go, there are two really important ducts. These are the main ones. You have the right lymphatic duct, and then you have something called the thoracic duct. And the right lymphatic duct, if we look in this image, this is one duct. This is not the one I'm talking about right now. And then over here, this little line, you can see it moving up over in this direction. This is referring to the thoracic, or the right lymphatic duct. Okay, so this one off to the side. This is the right lymphatic duct, and then the thoracic duct is going to be placed over here. Both are dumping. If you notice where they dump and meet into, they're going to be dumping into the subclavian veins. Okay, so do you see the entry point here? You have the subclavian veins. If we were to take an overall picture kind of what's happening, so this little area on the right side, that right lymphatic duct, all parts of the lymph system that are sitting in here, those are going to drain into that right lymphatic duct. And then the rest of the body, this other entire space, this is going to empty into the thoracic duct. Okay. Here you can kind of see a little bit of a better picture off to the right, a thoracic duct emptying into the subclavian area, and then you have the right lymphatic duct emptying into the subclavian vein. Lymphatic transport, the system again lacks a pumping organ, so the lymph itself is going to have to be propelled by the skeletal muscles. That's just a reiteration of what I was saying. Pulsations of nearby arteries can also help with this, but mainly contractions of smooth muscle cells and the actual lymphatics, those can also help. So they have a little bit more of addition to what you would just have a vein, but again, the main thing that's going to be pushing this fluid is the major pressure is going to be coming from the actual skeletal muscles moving. Okay? They're not exactly like veins because they do have other mechanisms that are going to help push that fluid. Some of their smooth muscle cells can contract, and then again, nearby arterioles, when they pump or the pressure behind them, when they get the pressure and they expand out, that's going to help move up some of the fluid as well. So elephantitis, this is what I was talking about, also known as lymphedema. Okay, edema is swelling. Mostly in the limbs is where we're going to see extreme swelling. If there's an infection, the fluid goes stagnant and the pathogens can accumulate. Okay, so that's not good. Certain types of cells that will sit in the lymph system, lymphocytes. So cytes again means cells. Lympho means cells in the lymph system. Okay. These are the primary cells in the lymphatic system. They're also immune cells. They respond to invading pathogens such as bacteria and viruses. Any body cell that looks abnormal, so cancer cells, they'll try to attack. We produce some minute amount of cancer cells daily. It's just a normal part of the process, and these lymphocytes will help keep them in check. They see it's not normal, they'll destroy that cell. If you have a foreign toxin, it'll work on getting that out. The lymphocytes themselves are considered to be a white blood cell, and if you were to take all the white blood cells and pull them together, there'll be about 20 to 30% of that collection. Okay. So, good amount. Remember we said leukocytes. Leukocytes are going to be a little different than lymphocytes. Leukocytes are the name we get the all white blood cells. Okay, so don't get those two terms mixed up. They both start with that L. Just lymph is specifically with the lymphatic system. Leuko has to do with the white blood cells. Leuko actually means white. There's a condition in the brain, for example, called leukomalacia. It's softening of the white matter in the brain. And so the leuko indicates that it has to do with the white matter. So anytime you see that word leuko, it typically referring to it's a white blood cell or it's white matter. It has that kind of that meaning to it. Okay. There's a lot of white blood cells. We're going to actually be going into immunity on Monday, so we'll start talking about immunity on Monday. But we'll introduce this a little bit. If you to look at the whole collection, remember we said that 25 to 30% are going to be those lymphocytes, and we can see that down here at the bottom here that gives 25 to 45, but it's probably closer to the 30. Lymphocytes are categorized as something called agranulocytes. Oh, another fun word, right? Agranulocytes. Okay. So when you think of something that's granular, what do you think of? Grainy, right? Granular grains as grains in it. Okay. If you put A typically in front of something, that means without. Okay, so an agranulocyte, cyte means cell. It's a cell without granules, a cell without grains. Okay? And it's typically the two groups that we place white blood cells in, one that appear like they have the grains or granules and ones that don't have the granules. And these lymphocytes are going to be the ones that don't have those granules. Okay? Monocytes is another one, but we'll get into that a little bit later. But lymphocytes would be categorized as agranulocytes. Most of the lymphocytes, why they are part of the lymph system, they're not just going to be floating in that fluid. They're going to be collected at different areas and very specific focal points, mainly found in the lymphoid organs and tissues. We have three classes, or three types. T cells. The maturation of T cells occurs in the thymus, and that's one way you can think of it. T for thymus, where they're made. So these are thymus matured cells, not made, but matured there. The primary object of T cells is to attack foreign cells. Another cool type of cell, and we'll get into this when we talk about antibodies. You know, people say, "Oh, I have the antibody for this," or when we want our bodies to make antibodies. Well, that depends on this other type of cell, and this type of cell is called a B cell. And a B cell is called a B cell because it's matured in the bone marrow. Okay, so think B for bone marrow. That's a B cell. These will have to mature a little bit more before they make antibodies in something called plasma cells. But in general, just think of B cells. Okay. And then we have these cells here. It says NK, but that stands for natural killer cells. So they naturally kill things just by the description of their name. They'll attack foreign cells, they'll attack infected cells, and they'll attack cancer cells. These are very much patrol cells for the body. Okay? They're usually one of the first ones on site. If it sees a cancer cell, it's going to release a whole bunch of stuff that's going to kill that cell. Or a bacterial cell will release a whole bunch of stuff that'll kill that cell. Or if a cell is infected by a virus, it's going to kill that cell for the sake of the tissue. Again, remember some of the organs and tissues that make up the lymph system. We've already talked about in the head area. You have the tonsils. We also have the thymus. We talked about the Peyer's patches. The appendix is also considered to be part of the system as well, and so is the spleen. And so the spleen is going to be a nice area where we're going to find a large collection of lymphocytes as well. They used to think for the longest time that the appendix really didn't have a role, but it does contribute to this immunity with this lymphocyte production. So. So this is just a kind of a diagram just going over the types of lymphocytes. We have T cells, B cells, and natural killer cells. Kind of what they do. I think kind of the brief description for this purpose, as far as the lymph system goes, I'm going to be happy about. We'll get more into detail on Monday about what their major role is exactly with the immune system. Lymphocytes can be sensitive to specific chemicals. These chemicals we call them antigens. Antigens, for example, can be anything from pathogens, fragments of a pathogen. If it breaks or if it releases, sheds off stuff, it can detect those antigens. Foreign compounds or chemicals. Once it sees those, it's going to stimulate an immune response that's going to lead to the destruction of the target compound or organism. Lymph nodes. Okay, so we kind of gave, if you're following the pattern, we kind of gave an overall description of the lymph system. You know, what is it? Why do we have it? What is it made up of? Okay, so if we looked at the structural components, you're going to have vessels. Those vessels will dump off into lymph nodes. Eventually, those nodes are going to congregate and merge together in trunks, and the fluid's eventually going to come back to the cardiovascular system via ducts. Okay. The capillary aspects of the lymph system, they're very loose compared to blood, to the cardiovascular network. They allow more stuff in, but because of that, they have to also screen it, and they're going to screen it through these white blood cells called lymphocytes. Okay. And so that's kind of where we're at with our talk. We talked about what lymphocytes are. They're immune cells. They're white blood cells. They make up almost about a third of all the white blood cells. Now we want to talk about nodes, and these are kind of some of the areas where some of these white blood cells will congregate. I like to also think about nodes kind of as the checkpoints. So the fluids that they're moving through, but they have to be checked out before it can pass on. Some will always escape. Let's say if you have a million things that don't belong there, okay, that first screening, you might get rid of a lot, but some are going to move through. And so you're going to have some of these steps that eventually will help make sure that this fluid returns nice and clean. Okay. We have them in our armpits, we have them in our necks, in our groins, different areas. The lymph nodes are small lymphoid organs found in the neck, groin, axilla, the armpits, and embedded in fibrous connective tissue. Their function is to filter, and collectively they will remove about 99% of the pathogens from the lymph. Okay, so pretty neat. Let's see if I get another. The basic concept, you have the vessels moving into the nodes. Okay, so if you see the arrows that are pointing into the system, the vessels are moving into these nodes. That fluid's going to sit here, kind of pool in here. And what's also going to be hanging out in here are the things that are going to check it out, called the, remember what these were? The cells, the specialized immune cells? Lymphocytes. Okay, so the lymphocytes, they are going to be basically hanging out in these nodes. Okay? And they're going to be looking for junk, basically. And if they see the junk, they're going to react to it. And if the junk gets too high, they're going to need help. And so the way they help is they call for backup. And so when backup comes in, you get more and more lymphocytes being made in this node. As more things occupy that node has to expand out and swell. Okay? So when a doctor checks your lymph nodes and they're checking for swelling, they're detecting to see if there's a bunch of white blood cells in there, right? Because when you get sick, those will swell because those lymphocytes are going to be fully activated to help clean your lymph so that your cardiovascular system will be nice and pure, if you will. Okay. Mm-hmm. Kind of cool. We already said the tonsils. There are tonsils. Anybody know anybody with tonsils removed? Anybody had to have their tonsils removed? No. Okay. So there are lymphoid nodules in the pharynx wall. If they're inflamed, it's called tonsillitis. Okay? That's another thing, just with all these terms, I'm trying to get a lot of names, but I like to point out things to help, if you're sitting there and you're taking a test later on, not even in this class, and you're like, what does that word mean? Kind of look for words that you're familiar with that have pieces of that. Okay, so anytime we see a site now, that should indicate it's a cell. Okay, or now I told you, anytime you see leuco, that should indicate it has the white. Okay, lymph is part of the lymph system. Okay, itis is another one. Itis typically is going to be with inflammation. Okay. These are just pictures of the tonsils. I don't want to go too much. Going back to our lymph node, it's a bean-shaped structure. There's actually two regions. There's a cortex. Typically when we say there's a cortex is the outer area, and then there's a medulla, and that's going to be the collecting area. So if you look in this image here you have a cortex region, and in the middle then we have the medulla. So cortex and medulla. The cortex is going to be full of dividing B cells. B cells are the ones that are producing antibodies, and there's still a type of lymphocytes. So remember, we talked about 3 types of lymphocytes. They were B cells. They're matured in the thymus. They're T cells, and then the ones that just like to kill things off, natural killer cells, NK cells. Typically, the lymph is going to enter through vessels. The vessels that they enter through, we call them afferent. We'll see this terminology again when we get to the kidneys. So vessels that enter something are typically afferent. When they're leaving something, we'll call them efferent. So the lymph will enter through the afferent lymphatic vessels. They'll travel into the cortex, eventually collect in the medulla, and then they'll exit an area called the hilum. This is the collecting area at the bean, if you will. This is the hilum, and they'll move down to either another node or to another area, eventually dumping back into the cardiovascular system. If you notice, just from this cartoon image, okay, we look over at the number of afferent vessels, and if you look at the number of afferent vessels versus the number of efferent vessels, what's a big difference that you see? Right, so there's a lot more afferent vessels to efferent vessels. Okay? So it's kind of like you ever have a shower that just really pours fast, and then you drain, it's very small, or it gets clogged and the water just builds up. So that's kind of the same concept. You make a log jam, if you will, you back up the fluid, and that gives the B cells, the lymphocytes, time to check out the fluid. Okay, so that's the reasoning behind that. You have a lot more fluid going in, but just a little area where they come out. That keeps that fluid in that node a little bit longer, and those lymphocytes can check it out, clean it up. Overall, the lymphoid organs are there to help protect the body, but it's only the lymph nodes that are going to be doing the filtering. Okay, so you might have the thymus, you might have these tissues, but it's the spleen, but it's really only the nodes themselves that are going to be filtering this out, checking out that lymph fluid. Okay, and that does it. We'll take a break there.